Let's talk today about layering, but in a slightly different way to how I have done before. Now, layering is the absolute core method I use for all of my drawing. I use it on every drawing. It doesn't matter if I'm trying to draw something really nice and smooth, or maybe some fair texture, or even quite a kind of rough texture. I always use layering. But I think it seems more complicated with a rough texture than it does with something smooth. So let's cover today building up layers with texture. Now I can show you by drawing these avocados, they have some really good, interesting skins on them with an awful lot of texture that we're going to have to build up. So I think it'd be easiest if I talk you through the process. I'll show you what I went through to build up these layers and how I created the texture. It's actually not dissimilar to how I go about creating fur. Now I will be drawing this from a reference photo. I want to try and make this avocado look as realistic as possible, and I find that to be the best way to do this. So we can use this photo as a template to create that more realistic texture. Now, before we get started, if you want to draw this with me in a lot more detail than we're going to go in this video, it is available on my Patreon. I have not only this drawing, but loads of other tutorials. And in every single one, I include really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colors I'll be using, sketch outlines, and the reference photo. I have tutorials using colored pencils, graphite pencils, and watercolor pencils, and a really good mix of different subjects, some that are reasonably quick and some that take much longer but are generally more impressive. Do check out the link in the description. So let me show you how I went about drawing this avocado, particularly the skin. And I start off in the way that I do for all of my drawings by building up some base layers. So what I want to do is look for the lightest color that I can see in each section of the avocado. And the lightest color that I can see in one area is not necessarily the same as the lightest color I can see in another area. So for example, here I'm starting off by filling in the inside of the avocado. And so towards the center, I would say the lightest color is a very light yellow, and around the edge, it is much more of a green, but a very light green. Now we want to particularly focus on the skin. So let's look for the lightest color we can see on this skin. Now I would say that it's these colors around here. This is very much the light patch on the skin. And this to me looks like a very light blue. So I'm going to take the closest match that I have in my set, and I want to put down a really nice even layer of this color. Now there's a few ways that I'm doing this. First off, I'm working in circular motions rather than just scribbling back and forth. That helps me get down a really nice even layer of the color. We're not worrying about any of the texture right now. We just want to get these underlying colors in. I also want to be pressing really nice and lightly. I don't want to be pressing hard. We will be building up a lot of the pencil one on top of another, and we need to make sure that we are able to do that. We don't want to put down a huge amount of pencil to begin with. Now to help me press really nice and lightly, notice that I'm holding the pencil pretty far back. I'm not holding it really close to the tip, and what that does is stop me from being able to press too hard. I also want to make sure I have a really nice and sharp pencil. It is so important for putting down, again, the pencil in a really nice and consistent way. Now I only want to be putting this blue pencil on the lighter areas of the skin. So that main patch that I showed you a second ago, there's also a little bit along the side of this avocado here. So let's build this up as well, still working in those circular motions. And then once I'm happy that I've got down all of the blue I need, I want to be putting down the lightest color in any other areas. So for example, on the rest of the skin, I would say it's much more of a green. So looking at the lighter spots around here, this is a very light green rather than the more bluey tone that you can see in the light patch at the top. So I can use the same green that I was using a second ago to just fill in any other areas of white paper. I am going over some of the blue areas as well. I really want to blend those colors together, help them overlap so I don't have any abrupt edges. But beyond that, I'm very much going about this in the same way as I did for the blue. The most important thing is that I am holding the pencil pretty far back to help me press nice and lightly. With this pencil, you'll notice, because it's quite a short pencil, I am using a pencil extender, so I am able to hold it further back. And then essentially what I'm going to do is work my way through the colours. So I started off with the absolute lightest colours. Let's gradually work our way towards the darker colours. And we will be building up some texture along the way here, now that I've built up something on the paper. So here I'm working with quite a kind of light brown. And this actually you can see particularly around the edge of the avocado. There's this light brown line around here. So let's add that in before moving on to some of the darker colours. So we're moving on to quite a dark green here. This isn't a dissimilar green to the green that I've used as the base layer. And I can start off by going around the edge of the avocado, anywhere where I can see some of this dark colour. And then I want to think about mapping in some of the texture. So I've got something down in the base layer, something to cover those lightest areas. Let's right now use a kind of mid-tone, I guess, to mark in all of the texture. So let's look at what's actually here. And what we want to do is look at this like it's a series of shapes rather than the bobbly texture of an avocado skin. So I can look for each area and look at where the lights and darks are. So for example, there is a very dark patch all around here with quite a kind of wobbly edge. There's a dip that comes in here and around here. There's this kind of shape here with lighter patches that I will want to avoid. And you can see all of these dark shapes going all along here. It's probably even easier to see when you're looking at this section here. Look at all of the actual shapes that are here. All of these kind of wiggly shapes. There's some curvy shapes and they all slot in together to make up the texture. Now, before we go back to looking at mapping in all of these shapes, let's also just pay attention to how dark a lot of the skin is, particularly when you look at down here. Look how dark this shadow is, as well as down here, and even some of the darker patches on here are pretty much black. They're certainly much darker than the dark green I'm using. And that is the key here, is I don't want to be using a really dark pencil to be mapping in these shapes. Even though this is still a reasonably dark colour, in comparison to most of the skin, I would say this is still quite light. So I can use a light to mid-tone colour like this one to start trying to map in all of those shapes. And then if I get something wrong, if it's not looking quite right, it means that it'll be much easier for me to go over the top of it and correct that shape with a darker pencil. It's just a lot more forgiving to gradually work from these lighter colours towards the darker colours. Now, something to remember when you're building up texture like this is that you don't need to get it perfect. Now, I am looking at the reference photo and trying to get it as accurate as I can to what I can see in the reference photo, but I'm not going to be able to get it perfect realistically. I just want to maybe, if anything, kind of use the patches in the reference photo a bit as inspiration. The key thing is that the texture on the skin is random because it's a natural object, and I can't be that random without some sort of guide helping me. So although I want to map in all of these shapes as accurately as I can, I don't need to get it exactly the same as the reference photo, but I am using the reference photo to help me. Now, this has to be the most difficult part of the whole drawing, of building up this texture. More than anything, it's just very time consuming and it takes a long time to try and build it up, getting in all of the different shapes. I am paying attention to, for example, as I work down the bottom, I think all of the shapes, all of the patches are getting a bit closer together. They were much more sparse at the top because it was lighter. And in fact, as it gets to the bottom, it becomes a solid block, as we saw a second ago. So once I've mapped in all of the shapes here, I've got all of this texture initially marked in. What we want to do is build upon that. So layer up a lot of pencil on top of this, and eventually it will start looking realistic. So I find it easiest to work one section at a time. Let's speed through building up some of the pencil on the stone of the avocado and go straight back to the skin. So what I'm doing here is now using a darker pencil to go back over this texture. I'm pretty much going over it in the same way, but now that I'm a bit more confident that I've got everything mapped out correctly, I can go back over it with a darker pencil. So here I'm using the darkest brown that I have in my set. As I said, a lot of the skin is really very dark and we do need to use some pretty dark colors. But now if there's any areas that aren't looking quite right, I can easily adjust them with this pencil. But you'll see that I am literally just going over it and perfecting that skin. There are some areas up the top that I don't need to go over because maybe the texture is a little bit lighter. It doesn't need to be as dark as this. But as I say, on the most part, I am going over with this brown. It doesn't matter that it's looking a little bit odd and patchy at the moment. It will come together. I just really want to perfect the underlying bulk of the texture before building up all of the other colors. And let's do exactly the same now with the darkest color. This is the black pencil. I only need to use this in a few areas really, generally where the two avocados are meeting each other, and on this very dark patch at the bottom, the very deep shadows towards the bases of both of the avocados. But once again, I'm either blocking in this area down the bottom as I have done before, or going back over the texture to build up those darker areas. I now have the base layers built up and the texture marked in. It's not looking right, but I have even the darkest colors built in, and now I can go through and adjust all the colors, kind of smooth everything out a little bit. So I can actually go back to that darker green that I used a second ago to initially map out all of those shapes to begin smoothing this out. Now again, when we actually look at the texture, what we can see is a series of very dark shapes creating all of that texture, and then a mixture of some pretty light green, but also some much darker green that's kind of just filling this whole area in. The same on here, there's some lighter little blue spots, but a lot of this is just a pretty dark green with some darker texture in between. So let's fill over the top of most of the avocado, and I'm building this up in a series of circular motions. There are times that I want to go over the texture a little bit more, and times when I want to be applying some pretty nice smooth and even coverage. Now remember, even if you're going over the top here with a even cover of the pencil using circular motions like we did before, you won't lose the texture. It will still show through. It's just building upon what's here. So this is starting to come together. It's starting to look a little bit less patchy, and the texture is looking a bit better. But let's just go back to that brown pencil, and some areas of the texture I think are not looking quite enough. They haven't got enough of the darker patches marked in, or I think they generally need to be made a bit darker. Sort of the underlying color needs to be made a little bit darker. So you can see I'm very much doing the same as I did before, going back over the patchy texture. And I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep adjusting the underlying colors, going back over the texture that I've already marked in over and over again until it builds up to be a more kind of solid color. So I can be using circular motions to be going over this area here. Because I added black into this corner because I need it to be really dark, that can sometimes look a little bit harsh. But if I go over it with the brown pencil, it just softens everything out. It makes it more like a dark brown rather than a much more harsh black. The same can be said for the brown pencil actually. If I go over an area I want to make it darker, I use the dark brown. I can then use the dark green over the top of it to make it more like a very dark green rather than a dark brown. So let's build up a few of these patches a little bit more, particularly around the edge with the dark brown. And then I can switch back to the dark green. And as I go here, I do start pressing a little bit harder. I want to really create more of a solid base here. Now do notice how I am avoiding some of the lighter patches. So where I want to build up some of that blue, where there's those really light areas of the texture, let's not go over those areas. But I can use some slightly firmer pressure to just block in a bit better what's here. And again, you can still see all of that texture that we've built up, but it's maybe not as harsh. So again, here on this part of the avocado, I can use circular motions over the top of all of that texture I've built up to create that more solid area. And here's a good example of where it's turning that dark brown into more like a dark green. And then once I'm happy that I filled in a lot of the shading on the really dark areas of the avocado skin, I can use the green that I used right at the very beginning, that slightly lighter green, to mark in some of those light lighter green areas. So I can still use a firmer pressure here, and you can see how clearly you can still see all of that texture. It's just creating that more solid look. So I want to add quite a bit of this lighter green at the top as well. Although, as I said, it is mostly blue up here. It's kind of a bluey green, really. Some of the lighter areas are also more of a green, and I don't have a huge amount of this light green up here. So let's just go over this texture, particularly blending out some of the edges of those darker colours that we added in. And I think that's looking much better. It still, as I say, looks textured, but maybe a bit less harsh. And now those lightest areas just need to be brightened up a little bit. So again, with quite a firm pressure, I can go over those blue areas back with this same blue we used before to just smooth everything out. I do want over the top of all of that texture to be nice and smooth, else it's just going to look odd and patchy. So now let's just speed through the rest of the drawing now that I am generally happy with the skin. Hopefully you'll see that it's not as hard as you might think to build up even quite a random texture like this. I always start by building up the base layers with the absolute lightest colours I can see in each area. And although you might not expect to see a light blue on a dark green skin of an avocado, I could see it, so I need to draw it in. Once I've created the nice, smooth, even base layers, I can then start mapping out that texture, starting with a kind of mid-tone colour before going back over it with the darker colours to lock in the shapes of the texture. Remember, I like to start with the lighter colours so it's a lot more forgiving if you make a mistake. And then once I'm happy I've built up all the texture, I can go back over those colours, start building up more of the kind of top colours, again using generally circular motions, generally nice and smooth colour to try and build up those overall colours. Going back over all of the texture that I built up doesn't make it disappear, so I can build a lot more pencil on top of that texture. I hope that that kind of takes a bit of the mystery out of how I build up textured areas and use layers to create the texture. Don't forget, if you want to go through this with me with a lot more detail, it is available on my Patreon. And if you want to take a bit more of a general look at layering, take a look at this video here, where we build up all of the colours needed to draw this pear. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.